Good afternoon. I think we'll go ahead and get started. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Peter Agre from Johns Hopkins. Peter is currently a university professor and Gilman Scholar and director of the Johns Hopkins Malaria Research Institute at the Bloomberg School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins. Peter is a native Minnesotan who got his chemistry degree at Augsburg College. Then, while a medical student at Hopkins, studying cholera, he fell in love with biomedical research. And after doing his internship and residency at Case Western, he came back to Hopkins as a postdoctoral fellow in cell biology. And I think that's when I first met him, when he came back as a postdoc. He began working with Van Bennett on the biochemistry of red blood cells in patients with congenital anemia. He was recruited by Victor McCusick to come and join the faculty at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine in 1984. He rose from the ranks of assistant professor to professor of biological chemistry and professor of medicine. And then Peter went down to Duke and served a short term, or 3 or 4 years, as Vice Chancellor for Science and Technology at Duke Medical Center, and returned to Johns Hopkins in 2008, where he holds the positions that I've elaborated for you. In 1992, his laboratory became widely known for discovering aquaporins, the family of water channels that are found throughout nature and responsible for numerous physiological processes in humans, including the kidney concentration as well as secretion of spinal fluid, aqueous humor, tears, sweat, and the release of glycerol from fat. Aquaporins have been implicated in many diseases, as you know, including fluid retention, bedwetting, brain edema, cataracts, poisoning, etc. Water transport in diverse organisms, including Anopheles mosquitoes, and parasites also involves aquaporins. And of course, as you all know, in 2003, Peter shared the Nobel Prize with Roderick McKinnon for discovering channels in cell membranes and the important implications there too. He's received lots of other honors, including 16 honorary doctorates. He is a commander in the Royal Norwegian Order of Merit from the King of Norway. Commander, I didn't know that. And also, he's received the Distinguished Eagle Scout Award from the Boy Scouts of America. And I'm an Eagle Scout myself, and I remember back in Baltimore, Peter convinced me to be the district commissioner for Boy Scouts in the city of Baltimore. You don't remember that, but you did. Anyway, it was fun. And of course, Peter is a member of lots of prestigious organizations, including the National Academy of Science, the Institute of Medicine, and he's also been past president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. It's been a real honor for me to have Peter as a colleague and friend, and I'm just thrilled to have him back on our campus for these 2 days. When I was a student and a postdoc and a junior faculty at Hopkins, he was one of my most valued colleagues, just an extraordinary human being, prince of a guy, and I'm really pleased and proud to be able to introduce him to you today. Peter.
What a kind introduction. Thank you, James. It's a pleasure to be here. And let me point out, I'm aware that I am on the greenest campus in the greenest city in the greenest state of the United States. It's great to be here. And it didn't take James very much time to convince me to accept this invitation. He's a trusted friend and colleague, and this has been something I've been looking forward to very much. So it's 2 lectures, and the letter was clear that they should not overlap considerably. The lecture today will be about international aspects of science, how science opens doors worldwide, and I literally mean that. And I think those of us here all realize this, so it'll be a sort of a remembering of the human side of science, who we met along the way during our careers, and how these friendships can sometimes have greater consequences than just the laboratory science. But just the laboratory science is pretty important too, and I'll talk about that tomorrow. So it's my pleasure. This first lecture will be sort of a National Geographic type lecture. a minimum of text with some pictures. So, the United States, it seems like my whole adult life we've been challenged by world opinions. Although I grew up in the Eisenhower era, when the US was widely acknowledged to be the savior of Europe, a champion for dignity and human rights around the world, something happened at the time of the Vietnam War that has caused us great national distress. And while we're not popular in general around the world, in Muslim countries in particular, we're very unpopular. This is a Carl Zogby poll, which illustrates a few points. First off, this was the year after the invasion of Iraq, not a popular time in our history. But when the citizens of 5 moderate Muslim nations were polled, in general, the United States, very few saw us favorably. The majority of these countries, the citizens of these countries saw us in a negative view. Something very, very wrong about how we present ourselves to the world. But as part of the same poll, when these same individuals were then questioned, what is your view of US science and technology? And not simply one form of science, but agricultural science, medical science, microelectronics. The responses, as you can see, were completely reciprocal. The great majority of these people suddenly were very favorable to the United States. And a few stalwarts are still negative. But there's something special about what we do as scientists that has great appeal worldwide. So I'll break my lecture into 4 parts, not equal, but just to touch on different aspects, starting with my scientific upbringing. I think it's probably true that anybody in science comes into science because of some human influence, a parent, a teacher, something, a scout leader, some event, because actually most people don't go into science. So we're the minority. There's some positive thing that caused us to go this way. And my origins are fairly modest. Like most people in science, come from the great middle class of immigrants. My family members being Scandinavians, dad's side Norwegians, mother's side mixed Norwegians and Swedes. And this was my dad, product of the Great Plains of South Dakota, who studied chemistry at the University of Minnesota at a time during the Depression where going to college was very difficult. All of the students were poor, all of those at land-grant universities, and I believe this campus is such. All of the male students at that time were members of the ROTC, and what became of them? Well, let's see, some of Dad's classmates you might have heard of, like Hubert Humphrey, and he was the worst student. Eric Severide, the news journalist, Melvin Calvin, the photosynthesis, Nobel Prize, Norman Borlaug, the Green Revolution. So those that went into science did pretty well. And Dad encouraged my siblings and me, particularly my brothers and me, being traditional 1950s. Girls grew up to be moms, dads grew up to become professionals. Boys grew up to be professionals, and dads. And like other families, we had family events, based on things in the neighborhood and the community and the church. And my brother Jim and I were Eagle Scouts. And this is a family picture I like to show because it illustrates, I think, the pride families have in these very modest events like scouting, but also it illustrates that life isn't always fair. So the great emphasis my father placed upon science education, I'd already mentioned, but my mother, who was a farm girl from South Dakota, never had the opportunity to go to college, but always was very eager that we should read and read widely, and she would read us the great books, the Laura Ingalls Wilder books, the Children's Bible, and encourage us to use our talents for the well-being of those less fortunate. And shown in this picture in the front is my little sister Ruth, a little girl with blonde hair, who at an early age developed the manifestations of major impulse control deficit, subnormal intelligence, has never had a normal life. And Paul, the little boy on your far right in the blue sweater, was diagnosed as mentally retarded. It's a correct medical term. I don't mean any pejoratives. Intellect deficit, motor skills deficits. And in fact, growing up in a family like this, and many of us have friends, relatives, family members who have these deficits, the idea that science is valuable and as wonderful as it is should be used for the well-being of others. And I had other interests. There are no pictures of me as a chemistry student in the Augsburg College chemistry laboratories, but I was a pretty enthusiastic, if fairly unsuccessful, soccer player. As a striker of the Augsburg College team, I think I scored 1 goal in 3 years. Not a very, but there were other interests. And some of these interests were flavored based upon the people that we met. I suspect quite a few people in this room recognize this photograph. This was a friend of my father's from California, Linus Pauling. And Dad, the small college chemistry professor, and Pauling, the famous research scientist from Caltech, met as members of the Education Committee for the American Chemical Society and struck up a friendship. It was really Pauling who set a very impressive stage for us very early on. He stayed at our home one time in Minnesota. Dad knew him. But he was not a scientist restricted to the laboratory, which was fantastic what his laboratory accomplished, but the extracurriculars. So back in the 1950s and the 1960s, Pauling, who received 2 Nobel Prizes, first in chemistry and the second in peace for the activities he led to raise the awareness of the dangers of thermonuclear testing, something no elected member of Congress could possibly accomplish. Pauling did this by writing a bestseller, No More War, and using every public speaking event to lead to activities, speeches, or in this case a protest outside of the White House, to raise the awareness of the public. This event, by the way, in 1962 is a very interesting event. So Pauling and his wife were at the White House for the dinner President Kennedy hosted in honor of 49 Nobel Prize winners and spouses. And of course, he used the protest, the opportunity in the afternoon to lead a protest outside of the White House. 6 o'clock, he straightened his tie, went in for the reception, waited in line, and met President Kennedy, who leaned forward and said, "Professor Pauling, I believe you've been around here earlier today." Well, this was no secret. It was on the national news. And by the end of the evening, Pauling is dancing with Jacqueline Kennedy. President Kennedy is dancing with Ava Helling Pauling. And an important thing happened. Kennedy then backed the Limited Test Ban Treaty, which he signed just weeks before his death. A scientist brought this to his awareness. And testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere was forbidden because of the activities of this research scientist who didn't have the common knowledge to stay only in the lab. He took it on the road. So science is an international career. I suspect most of us have international roots. Hell, if you were born outside of the United States, or if your parents were born, either one were born outside of the United States, just raise your hand. Okay, so that's half the audience. We all came from somewhere. And I think we're often viewed as a melting pot. I think we're more of a heterogeneous group of people representing the wonderful values of a variety of people around the world. But as scientists, it doesn't end with our origins. We interact with international people every day of the year. The Olympics is a wonderful international event, but it's every 4 years. Science is ongoing every day, every week, every month of the year, and brings us together. So I decided I wanted to go into global health, in large part flavored by the wonderful community we had back in Minnesota, the Norwegian Lutheran medical missionaries. These were not evangelical missionaries. These were nurses, surgeons, doctors, who went to the third world and started clinics taking care of the poor, the sick, and did so for decades at a time. So I matriculated at Johns Hopkins, probably as some kind of a geographic affirmative action candidate. Every year they got some guy from Minnesota and North Dakota. That's how it worked. Whatever opens the door. And it was a fantastic opportunity for me. And so I, as a medical student, was interested in tropical medicine, world health, and has latched on the problem of infectious diarrheal illnesses as an important research subject. Cholera was sweeping the world, Southeast Asia, I should say, South Asia, in the early 1970s. And with the isolation of the cholera toxin by Richard Finkelstein at the University of Texas, suddenly this horrible diarrheal disease became a molecular defect. A protein with a ligand led to an activation of adenylate cyclase and release of huge amounts of diarrheal fluid. And so my challenge in the lab was to study the E. coli variants of cholera that released an exotoxin believed to be similar to cholera toxin. And I joined the lab of Pedro Cuatro Casas, shown in the center, the smiling, bald-headed young gentleman, a refugee from Franco's Spain, who recruited an interesting group of people from all around the world. Shown here is Gianfredo Pucca, his Italian film actor friend. Gianfredo, a pretty remarkable person. My wife will tell you he is still, at the age of 70, the handsomest man on the planet. He was a champion downhill ski racer, son of a wealthy Italian neurologist who told him always, Gianfredo, you will become a scientist, an academic. But Gianfredo had these distractions. Being so handsome, he was identified by a famous Italian director and cast to play the role of a gigolo in a famous movie. His girlfriend, who he married, Anna Maria, was the heiress to the Vespa fortune, so he became a billionaire. What would someone like this want to study in the laboratory? Remember, he's Italian, the molecular basis of femininity. And he solved it with a paper in Nature in 1970, isolation of the estrogen receptor by affinity chromatography, Pucca, Sica, Nola, Bresciani. It was a pretty interesting laboratory that Pedro had, although most were not as photogenic as Gianfredo. Here we are, a group in the laboratory. And I remember at this time actually working on E. coli diarrheal diseases in the laboratory, going to a mixer at Goucher College, which was at that time, a women's college, now it's co-ed, meeting an attractive young lady. We're having a wonderful conversation, and she asked me that fateful question, Peter, what kind of medical specialty are you interested in? Now, I'm from Minnesota, so I told her the truth. I said, I'm interested in diarrheal disease. That was the end of that relationship. But I soon thereafter, before I get ahead of myself, I'll talk about these two. Also in the laboratory were these two people. I'll back up. I've given this lecture before, but I get so enthusiastic, I forget where I am. So these two individuals come from all over the world. There were very few women in science in the early 1970s. This is a new advance for the better. But these people came from all around the world, and this picture is a Polish snake collector, a French psychiatrist, a big wave surfer from Hawaii. And one summer we were joined by these two gentlemen, two laughing, bearded young men from the back in the 70s. What's so special about this? On your left is Naji Sahyun, a graduate of American University in Beirut. Brilliant, perhaps their most brilliant graduate. But I became friends with Naji, who was quite shy, and he shared with me the interesting background. He was a Palestinian. His mother was Lebanese, his father was Palestinian, and he grew up with the notion that Israel is an evil institution, an evil state, and that all American Jews are Zionists. He was raised with this. And shown on the right is Marvin Ira Siegel, son of an Orthodox rabbi from Brooklyn, New York, roly-poly, garrulous, who grew up with the idea that all Palestinians are evil, devil-like people. They worked together in the laboratory, and as you can see, they became the best of friends for the rest of their life. There's something special that happens in laboratories, in addition to the lab science. So I told you the story about Goucher College. I soon thereafter met this lady, who's now my wife, Mary, raised in Maryland, grew up on a farm, who had the foresight to realize there was some potential in me. I looked like a member of the Manson gang at this time. And she always encouraged me to pursue the science, but she did set some limits. She said, if you're going to work on diarrheal disease, please don't bring your work home at night. So skipping ahead, tomorrow I'll give a technical lecture on the discovery and the functions of the water channels. But of course, diarrheal diseases are problematic because of the loss of water, sometimes in huge volumes leading to collapse of the circulatory system, shock, and death. And the notion of how water is transported through our bodies is something I never paid any attention to as a student, but fortunately a very dedicated group of physiologists and biophysicists had looked at this in great concern. So tomorrow I'll talk about the water channels. Today I'm just going to mention the names of our colleagues in these stories because it's a complex group of international scientists who we teamed up with because we were a small lab. We were challenged in terms of both the number of people in our lab and the resources. And by teaming up with scientists in other labs, you can expand your repertoire remarkably. So we've solved the structure in collaboration with these two men. On the left, Yoshinori Fujiyoshi from Kyoto. On the right, Andreas Engel from the University of Basel in Switzerland. Imagine that. A medical doctor solves the structure of an important problem, a protein, by collaboration. There are no limits to what we can do. And the structure shown here, I'll talk about tomorrow. We got into the physiology by pinpointing the location where this first protein, aquaporin 1, was located. We did this in collaboration with Søren Nielsen at the University of Aarhus. Søren was all of 29 years old when we started these studies, and was able to really pinpoint the presence of the proteins, particularly in kidney, and I'll skip through the specifics today. There are multiple members of this family. We now know there are 13 human homologs, and if you look at the gene pile-up, there are hundreds of aquaporins from plants, other mammals, microorganisms, even archaea. So it's a big story. So we looked at a number of organ systems and found different members of the family. The lens of the eye had a protein referred to as major intrinsic protein, MIP, which we now classify as aquaporin 0, work of Masato Yasui, a postdoc from Japan who's now the chair of pharmacology at Keio University. Aquaporin 4 in brain, which I'll dwell on tomorrow. Water transport in brain is quite important, but the clinical significance of this emerged in large part because of our collaboration with our colleagues at the University of Oslo in Norway, where a brilliant young scientist named Mahmoud Amiri Mahadam led a series of studies. Now, you may be well aware that Mahmoud is not a common name in Norway. In fact, Mahmoud came to these studies in a very interesting indirect way. Born to an Iranian university family, they fled. They were refugees in a camp in Pakistan when he was rescued by the Norwegian Social Services. And given the opportunity to study science, medicine, he's now one of the top university faculty members and a leading neuroscientist. And I'll talk about the work, but in short, defects in aquaporin 4, localization or structure or expression levels could be very useful in the prevention of brain edema. AQP5 from secretory glands, cloned by Surabhi Raina from Banaras Hindu University in India, who's joined us as a postdoc, who's now a faculty member at the University of Syracuse. Aquaglyceroporins, similar in sequence with slightly different structures permeated by glycerol, allowing the basal levels of our skin to become glycerolized, increasing the water barrier in skin. Aquaglyceroporin 7 in fat, the release of glycerol during fasting and starvation. 9 in liver, conversion of that glycerol to glucose. Again, these are all international studies involving individuals from around the world. Aquaglyceroporin 7 and 9 actually have major roles in explaining the defense against arsenic poisoning. It's just a big problem in eastern India and Bangladesh. I'll go through the science tomorrow, but I just wanted to highlight the people involved in these problems are really an international cascade of scientists. And aquaporins in plants, something that I think several members of your faculty here know a lot more about than I do. So we were having a very good and fairly successful run in science, but science is about new adventures. It's not about replaying the hits of the past. It's about making new discoveries. And that's, I think, one reason it's so hard for us to quit, to actually retire and give it up, because there's always a new adventure. And our laboratory has gotten into malaria in a big way. And malaria is a problem which is complex in terms of its biological origins, and has huge human significance. There's an industry in sub-Saharan Africa which we would like to be less necessary because of the deaths from malaria. The World Health Organization calculates that between 500,000 and 800,000 children in sub-Saharan Africa will die every year, this year, of malaria. And while malaria was widespread in most, not all, but most countries around the world 100 years ago, it even existed in northern United States and Canada, it's now restricted to smaller areas. But as you can see, sub-Saharan Africa has the heaviest concentration of malaria. And it's a complex problem, but the very famous part of malaria is the invasion of red blood cells the destruction of red cells, horrific fevers, and the release of these parasites. So it remains, well, in some ways, a 19th century disease which is still out of control in the 21st century. And it involves mosquitoes, again, something that members of your faculty here are much more knowledgeable about than I am. In both the parasite phase and the mosquito phase, aquaporins are involved. So the science has taken us into an area, but I don't think we're religiously required to stay in one part of science. I think we're freely eligible, if our curiosity takes us elsewhere, to go elsewhere. And I think the international aspects of the malaria problem, as well as the biology and the clinical need, has made it a very easy decision for me to follow a new direction. So who gets malaria? And while malaria can infect people of any age, it's most severe in small children. And this is where the greatest morbidity and mortality occurs. Kids like these little youngsters who live outside of our research station in southern Zambia, not wealthy by American standards, probably fairly well off by African standards, but they're wearing cast-off t-shirts, and at least some of them have sandals. They're healthy, they're happy, they have families, and they don't have malaria. It's something that can be prevented, and if it occurs, can be well treated. I'll talk more about this little youngster tomorrow, but he was not so fortunate. He came into the hospital with nearly lethal cerebral malaria in coma. His life was saved, but he's never recovered. He's left with cortical blindness. So the Malaria Research Institute that I'm now part of, which resulted from a magnificent gift. Philanthropy is a very important part of our lives. A gift from Mayor Bloomberg, the mayor of New York City, to allow us to get a critical mass at Johns Hopkins. And part of the mass is directed towards field studies in rural Africa. And we've focused our efforts in Zambia and Zimbabwe. And here's part of our research team. This was taken about 3 years ago. Mostly Zambian scientists, with the exception of, there's myself, and then Philip Tuma, you can see the man in the sunglasses, who's the clinical director of the mission hospital in southern Zambia. Sugano Marakura, on your right, my left in the photo, a Zimbabwean trained at Oxford University who wants to return to his home country to develop malaria programs. And the efforts, which are actually a research program meant to develop better methods for the diagnosis, prevention of malaria, and treatment of malaria, have had some pretty profound consequences. So I showed you the picture of the children, and the outcome of these studies has been fairly striking. Over the past 12 years, we've got 2 more years that I don't have on this figure, the number of admissions to the hospital have declined from about 1,500 or 2,000 per year. With the introduction of artemisinin and combination therapy, an effective medical treatment has been driven down. The year that the artemisinins were not available because of restocking, the problem resurged and further declined, and the introduction of the insecticide-treated bed nets drove it down still further. And for the last 2 years, we've averaged about 24 malaria cases per year, with 1 or 2 deaths rather than 100 or so deaths. So reasonable control is being established, but it's not eliminated. We know it'll happen if we quit our efforts, it'll come right back. Now, the children that get to malaria don't always live right down the path from the hospital. In fact, by and large, these are people living in the most remote areas of rural Africa. Our field station, I should point out, while it is sort of a hub of activity, is 20 miles from the nearest road. So this is really a place in the sticks, and the domiciles are often connected by simply tracks such as this, which in the beginning of the rainy season looks like it would be easy, but by the end of the rainy season, when the grasses are 2 meters tall, it gets a little hard to get around. And this is where I think many of the 2 billion or so humans who are amongst the poorest of the poor, living on less than $2 a day, are working their hearts out to provide for the families and take care of them. And while things are always challenging, when illness such as malaria occurs, things come to a screeching halt. And here's a member of our field team doing surveillance of members of a domicile where a case of malaria had been identified, and we're now looking for the carriers, the silent carriers, the source of the parasites. And while this is not a cheerful looking group, they're not used to having their pictures taken. This is a very wonderful group. These family members are very religious. They're very dedicated and quite grateful for what we're doing. But yet their lives are very difficult. Imagine living, surviving, farming with implements which were obsolete here in the United States 150 years ago to provide. And of course, the people in these families are working incredibly hard, including the children. Shown here are siblings. The older children look out for the younger children, who look out for the youngest children. They're carrying bags of maize to the village to be ground into cornmeal. But they also know how to have fun. These little boys greeted us when we arrived in northern Zambia at a new surveillance site. Oftentimes when I'm exercising in the morning, jogging or hiking along, the little kids will ask me, because English is, of course, in Zimbabwe and Zambia, English is their national language. They speak tribal languages like Shona and Tonga, but they ask me, "Where are you going?" And I say, "I'm just jogging." And then they ask me, "Where are you from?" And I always tell them, "I am from the United States. Barack Obama is my president." And the response is always, "Yes, he is our hero." I don't think these are members of the Democratic Party or Republican Party. These are kids. They like what the United States is doing for them. And this university-based science, which eventually makes its way to the field, is a very positive thing to be undertaking. And the notion that in the third world they don't value life, we've heard this is something that's been said. It's, of course, completely incorrect. The developing world, they revere children, they love children. The family resources are saved for the well-being of the youngsters, just so that they can have normal, happy, healthy lives. The little girl here has a school book upside down. It says, "School is cool." There's no problem with the love of the children in Africa. I think this goes without saying. Now, the international problems of malaria are made very clear when we compare our work in Zambia and Zimbabwe. Historically, these are the two halves of the former colony of Rhodesia, Zambia being what was known as Northern Rhodesia, Zimbabwe being what was known as Southern Rhodesia. Southern Rhodesia being the wealthier of the two daughter states. But the outcomes after liberation are quite different. In Zambia, with Kenneth Kaunda's election, they've had a fairly good liberal democracy, and things are coming along pretty well. In Zimbabwe, they've had other problems because it's been first a white supremacist dictatorship, followed by a black dictatorship. And our surveillance now in eastern Zimbabwe is revealing that, in fact, malaria has returned, a place where it was well controlled because of the erosion of public health standards. So this is Robert Mugabe, who, let's give him credit, he liberated Zimbabwe from a racist regime. But you can stay too long, as he has. At age 89, he's running for president again after 35 years, and the country has been driven into the ground. But it's a rich country, as I said. This is a tea estate in eastern Zimbabwe. You'd think that they would have all of their problems cared for, but malaria is a wily and very dangerous organism. Even the workers at the tea estates, they can drive tractors and have fairly rich lives by African standards. Wonderful young people are still vulnerable to the ravages of malaria. This valley, the Hundy Valley in eastern Zimbabwe has more than a 100% malaria rate, more than one episode per person per year. Yet the infrastructure, while challenged, is still present. And so what we're finding is that clinics such as this St. Peter's Clinic have a very dedicated group of nurses who are on the job 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. I remember talking to one nurse, asked her how long she's been on duty. She said, since 1994. Yet when the resources run thin, one of them has to hike. It's usually Emmanuel, the gentleman in the far back on the left, hikes 9 miles to the regional hospital to get the resupplies of artemisins. They should be able to do better. And I think with proper guidance from above, things will get better. But every morning, it's the same thing. Mothers bringing in their children, most of them sick with malaria. But when they recover, you have everything to look forward to. It's a wonderful group of people. This grandfather was very proud of his Sunday finest. And here is a group baptizing members of their community in the river. They have really interesting names in Zimbabwe. Some are religious names like Miriam, Moses. I remember one morning we met Benjamin, Lazarus, Shadrach, Meshach. We never met in Abednego. And they all have other unique Zimbabwean names. Love more, learn more, give more. I remember in a hotel in Eastern Zimbabwe meeting a waiter, his name tag said Never. So I said, is Never your name? He said, well, it's a shortened form. My real name is Nevermore. So I said, there must be a story. How do you happen to be named Nevermore? He said, well, I'm the youngest of 9 children. My mother said, Nevermore. And here's Sungano in the blue shirt outside of the National Institutes of Health in Harare. Good infrastructure, but not functioning well. They don't have money for resources, for supplies, even though Zimbabwe is a very rich country because of the corruption and the lack of organization. Things aren't having their effect. And we're hoping with Sungano's presence we can improve things and find out how we can reduce the prevalence of malaria in Zimbabwe. So science and human rights, I'm kind of thinking I'll go very quickly through this. As a member of the National Academy of Sciences, I joined the Committee on Human Rights, a really wonderful organization which works behind the scenes. Now this is very different from the human rights efforts led by politicians, which are always in front of the cameras. But it turns out that it's behind the scenes as scientists communicating with our counterparts in countries around the world, and yes, cruel dictatorships like Libya and North Korea and Myanmar have scientists. Behind the scenes, we can connect in special ways, and I followed Torsten Wiesel as chair of the Committee on Human Rights. And some of the cases I'd just like to share with you are amazing. This is Saad Ibrahim, an Egyptian sociologist, imprisoned because he challenged the Mubarak regime, beaten mercilessly, released from prison because of a relentless campaign behind the scenes, showing that it was actually in the best interest of Egypt to release Mubarak. He has tears in his eyes, as you can see this photograph. There was a group of nurses from Bulgaria, 5 nurses and a Palestinian physician, sentenced to execution in Libya, allegedly for perpetrating HIV infections in children in the hospital in Benghazi. Of course, they were the scapegoats. It was the shoddy hospital facilities that preceded their entry into Libya, but they were sentenced to death. Muammar Gaddafi himself was hamstrung because the public sentiment demanded the execution of these people. So again, behind the scenes, and this is involving members of the National Academy, I myself was not involved in either of these cases, were able to convey to his son, Saif Islam, and Muammar Gaddafi himself, by direct meetings, that there is a face-saving alternative to the execution of these people, and it involved a transfer of funds from the European Union under the decoy of a visit by President Sarkozy's wife. The individuals were released to serve out their sentences, life sentences in Bulgaria, and of course upon arrival in Bulgarian airspace they were pardoned, and so lives were saved. Probably anything direct and public would not have worked. Finally, I'll tell you about Benyak Sen, an Indian pediatrician, sentenced to life in prison for having taken care of individuals who turned out to be Naxalite rebels in eastern India. Even India, the largest democracy in the world, has much to benefit in terms of rule of law. And Sen was convicted, was charged and held for years without trial, finally released. But then when the trial was held, he was convicted with a life sentence, but he's now released on bail pending the appeal. It was a combination of both public letters, meeting with the governments of India leadership, and behind-the-scenes activities led to his release, and we hope he will be finally acquitted. And as an example where others can get involved, I'd just like to highlight the existence of an organization referred to as IPSO, the Israeli-Palestinian Science Organization, led by scientists. President Menachem Yari, president of the Israeli Academy of Sciences and former president of Tel Aviv University, and his counterpart, Sari Nusseibeh, a social economist, Stanford graduate, who's president of Al-Quds Islamic University, who are raising funds for research activities in Israel where Palestinians can participate. It's a very big challenge raising the money, but in all instances, the activities have led to peaceful cooperations and friendships. So in closing, I'm going to talk now about some science diplomacy visits. I'm just skimming through some of my travel photographs here. And this was undertaken in collaboration with Von Tarikian and the Center for Science Diplomacy at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. I was honored to be president of the AAAS in 2009 and 2010 when this center opened. And with Von's leadership, we led a series of science diplomatic visits to the countries you can see listed. I won't be talking about our visits to Myanmar, Burma, 3 years ago, Tunisia, Lebanon, or most recently to Iran. I was in Iran last summer and will return in about 6 weeks after their elections. But I will talk briefly about our work in Cuba and in North Korea. It seems like there's never an end to the challenges, but there's never an end to the opportunities as scientists. Cuba now, since the Obama administration has been in office, has been more accessible. Laws have not changed, but the interpretation of guidelines has been liberalized. So many academic groups, I suspect some people here have been to Cuba. And it's an interesting holdover of the Cold War era. And of course, those who visit Cuba will tell you there are many reminders of the revolution, which they remember so favorably. And of course, there are some of the vintage cars that are preserved. By and large, I have to point out that the average car in the streets of Havana is a beat-up wreck with probably 500 to 700,000 miles on it. But they have a few of the old cars, and of course, the nostalgia for these is remarkable. And they're very happy to have international visitors. Cuba has suffered tremendously since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Their personal per capita wealth has declined by 75% since 1989. Tourism is now their leading industry. And they're very friendly, sometimes a little bit too friendly. And where there has been investment, the old architecture is remarkable. Old Havana is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But where there has not been investment, things are crumbling, things are in decay, and there's a lot of room for improvement. So I went there to meet with the scientists. Here I am with the president of the Cuban National Biotechnology Laboratory on the left, and the director of the Finlay Vaccine Institute on the right. And of these old bulls, of course, they are glad to tell us about Cuban science, which is focused upon preventing people from getting sick. Not a bad thing to focus on if you have limited resources, frankly. This gentleman probably needs no introduction. I actually had the opportunity to spend an evening with Fidel Castro. It was pretty interesting. I like to say we had a conversation. 99% of the time I was listening and he was doing this, talking about the revolution, or the Bay of Pigs, the missile crisis. But then there was time for some questions. And Alan Roebuck from Rutgers University was there with me. He's an atmospheric scientist. And he asked some questions about Cuban atmospheric work. And I asked about healthcare. And I was not expecting the answer that I received. But in fact, Fidel Castro contended, and I think he was telling the truth, that in fact healthcare and access to healthcare was one of the major reasons for the revolution. Fidel Castro was the son of a wealthy Spanish landowner who moved to Cuba. His mother was the maid. He was an illegitimate child. And so he grew up both in the villa and in the countryside. And what he realized is that the peasants had virtually no access to health care unless they had money, something to barter, chickens or a pig or something, because no pre-revolutionary physician in Cuba saw patients without payment in advance. And 3/4 of the physicians lived in Havana, and probably 80% of the physicians left Cuba after the revolution, so something had to be done. And in fact, focusing on preventing disease, which I think we'll all agree is an important development, elimination of things such as malaria have been accomplished. And the reality is that the average lifespan in Cuba is a year longer than the average lifespan in the United States of America. So this is not to suggest this is the Michael Moore idyllic paradise in the Caribbean, but they have done some very interesting things in healthcare. And by the end of the evening, I think there were many exchanges which were very positive, and it was a very curious event. I was invited to lecture at the University of Havana, not quite knowing what to expect. I gave my lecture, the one I'm going to give tomorrow, about aquaporins, and I wasn't convinced the students were really interested. So at the end of the lecture, they swarmed the podium. I felt like I was some kind of mini rock star or something. It's because they're so hungry for contact with scientists from abroad. They truly want to have scientific opportunities. And this is an invitation we should not ignore. I think the chance for young Cubans to study in the United States will become more and more available. I think our differences are soon going to be resolved. I hope, ever the optimist, that we can renew relations with Cuba. And science will serve as a way of opening the door, and good things will happen. Now, I'll close by talking about some of our experiences in North Korea, which is a much more difficult subject matter and made I guess, current by the events over the last few weeks. Our first visit to North Korea was in December of 2009. We've been back subsequently and met with North Korean scientists outside of North Korea. It's clearly the hermit kingdom, isolated in many ways. Shown here, I am with our scientific group from the AAAS and the leader of one of their biotechnology laboratories in Pyongyang. Those my age might remember the TV show The Twilight Zone. It looks real, but there's something that's not real. And of course, Pyongyang is very much like the Twilight Zone. It's a city, but there's something eerie in its absence. The operatic singing from the train station at 5 in the morning, encouraging workers to go to work for the country. But the streets are empty. This is 10 o'clock Monday morning, downtown Pyongyang. Where is everybody? It's obviously not representative of the true North Korea. And as we are well aware, it's been run by a basic familial dictatorship. Kim Il-sung, shown in the far right, followed by Kim Jong-il on the left, and now by Kim Jong-un. But it may well be that Kim Jong-un, the 29-year-old leader, is probably not working independently, but orchestrated by a behind-the-scenes Stalinistic group. But because they have absolute control of the country, the public don't know what's real and what's not real. They only know what they hear, and they believe it. Because there's this notion, it's a myth, of juche, of self-reliance, go it alone. But of course, North Korea is not going it alone. They do not raise enough foodstuffs to feed the population. They've had massive starvations in the past, and they use local embargoes of food to punish potential dissidents in the countryside. And so the self-reliance is really more mythical than real. But again, they're constantly reminded to work hard on the basis, on behalf of the country. At the People's Reading Room in downtown Pyongyang, interestingly on display should be Science Magazine. There is some common ground, even with North Korea. The interest in science may be a thread that we can follow. And I'm showing you some photographs of a number of North Korean scientists. Here I am with the chair of their State Academy of Sciences at the end of our first meeting in 2009. I'm actually presenting him with the Hopkins Oster tie, which was the tie I wore when I gave the Nobel lecture in Stockholm, which I gave to the State Academy of Sciences, not for the leadership, but to preserve for the first North Korean who wins a Nobel Prize. And it will happen, maybe not in my lifetime, but it will happen. And other members of our entourage, the scientists, very decent, nice people, but in every case, members of the party. You can tell because they have the Kim Il-sung lapel pin. Although it doesn't invariably mean you're a member. I was given one pin, which I have yet to wear. They're doing biotechnology. They're doing plant biotechnology because it's clear that they can't feed their people. They're looking for improved agricultural methodologies to feed the people. Now, that's my wake-up call. There's an opportunity I'd like to point out that we all have in the form of a university in North Korea named the Pyongyang University of Science and Technology. Excuse me. This is the one and only private university in North Korea. It's an English language university outside of Pyongyang. And it resulted from the magnificent gift of this man, James Kim, a Korean-born businessman living in Florida, who's leaving his entire fortune to bridge the gap between Korea and the West by building the Pyongyang University of Science and Technology, where amongst the best and most talented young North Koreans will study with American lecturers, largely volunteers. People like ourselves can go there for weeks at a time and lecture about our subject matter. Proselytizing for religion is off limits. Political discussions are off limits. It's all about the science. Now, the Pyongyang University of Science and Technology is nobody's idea of a party school, unless you consider the Communist Party their only party. The students wear suits. You notice they're only males. They march to class singing patriotic songs about the great revolution, or liberation, and death to all enemies, things of that sort. They sit in attention at the lectures. Attendance is mandatory. And I was a little challenged. Oftentimes in my lectures, I'll tell a joke at the beginning just to get a sense, is anybody listening? Do they know what I'm talking about? And I told these young people at this occasion my best joke. Maybe I'll tell it tomorrow. Anyway, I told my joke in dead silence. Then I explained, that was a joke. That was funny. And they burst into laughter, spontaneously, I guess, in unison. What's going on? And the answer is they're keenly aware that they're being observed. North Korean intelligence agents are members of the North Korean faculty. It's not all Americans. Every American there has a counterpart who's a North Korean. And if you look over the shoulder of the gentleman, the young students on the left, there's a gentleman in the distance. There's one of the university officers who's paying close attention to the students talking to the press. Always being observed. And of course, since public executions and starvation, there are methods of dealing with dissidents. No one steps out of line. But I think there's reason for hope and optimism. As I said in the beginning of the discussion of North Korea, the scientists that we met there are largely men and women like ourselves, interested in the science with the understanding that this may make for a better life for our children and our grandchildren. There's clearly a common bond. And I'm shown here with Rong-Yi Hong, the director of the International Bureau of the State Academy of Science. And we've become, I think, quite good friends. I mean that literally. After spending a week together in Pyongyang on our first visit, we shared the final breakfast together. And he shared with me an interesting story. He said, you know, Peter, my grandson, who's 6 years old, lives with his wife and with him. The son and the daughter-in-law have jobs which make it difficult to take care of the child during the week. So the grandson was living with him, and he explained to the grandson that he, Dr. Hong, would be gone for the next week, staying at a hotel in Pyongyang with American scientists. And the little boy looked at his grandfather with great concern. He said, "Grandfather, bring the rifle." The boy speaking his honest fear that his grandfather would be in jeopardy, because the North Korean children are raised with the idea that Westerners are evil and Americans are devils. I remember at an occasion at a museum outside of Pyongyang, a little child of a worker from the countryside saw an Englishman, part of our group, makes a gun-like thing with his fingers. It goes, we're bad. Well, so Dr. Hong explains that his grandson is afraid that I'll be menacing to him. And it occurred to me that I had a box of granola bars I'd brought just for some snacks in case I couldn't handle the kimchi, but the kimchi was great. I gave him the unopened box of granola bars and said, Dr. Hong, give these to your grandson, and I thought nothing more of it. Now, the next time I met with the State Academy of Science, it was a year and a quarter subsequently, we met at the Carter Center in Atlanta, Georgia, and the U.S. State Department approved the visit. They were not allowed to visit Washington, D.C., but we met at the Carter Center, and the North Koreans have a very positive view of President Carter. But we started off in the formal setting as adversaries on the opposite sides of a long table. I was sitting right across from Dr. Hong because I was the senior American scientist in the delegation. And he delivered a litany, rehearsed litany of complaints that these resources have not been made available, we cannot collaborate, this is not ongoing, we cannot succeed. The superiors in Korea believe this is a waste, and it was my job to respond. And for a moment I was speechless, then I said, the first thing that came to mind, I said, Dr. Hong, how's your grandson? And I noticed a little smile on his face. He said, why, he's fine. I said, did he tell you to bring the rifle? And he said, why, no. But he did say to bring back some candy. Maybe this is what actually science diplomacy is. A scientist and a counterpart of science and the grandson, all realizing that we share a common humanity, and that the door that the science opened may eventually have some positive values. We're not going to change the world overnight. We're not there as agents of the U.S. State Department. We are there as American scientists, and our reception is very positive. And I think this is an invitation we should take seriously. So, presumably some people here speak Mandarin, and it was made known to me by a wonderful Chinese postdoctoral fellow in the laboratory that the word for crisis in Chinese, and it's very similar in Korean, weiji. Am I pronouncing that right? Anybody tell me? Weiji. It's actually, I'm getting thumbs up. In Korean, it's weiji. Similar characters, but it's actually two characters. And I think everybody realizes this now. Crisis is combination of the character for a time of danger and a time of opportunity. And the danger that we face in the world due to global pestilence, disease, thermonuclear war, climate change is very real. But the opportunity brought by science is an opportunity that is going to be unparalleled. And we need to use our opportunities to pursue the well-being of the planet whenever we can. And I show this picture again of Hopkins, where I work and have worked now for more than 40 years. At the end of the day, and the young scientists should realize that the old scientists were once young, and we had adventures, and we never really knew exactly what was going to happen. But in the end, it was a good activity. It brought scientific rewards, personal rewards, and basically, we've each, I will leave the world a little bit better because of it. And with that, let me thank you for attending my lecture today, and anybody interested in aquaporin and water channels, come tomorrow. We'll have part 2. Dean Hildreth, who I'm used to calling James, would like to know if there are any questions.
The lecture tomorrow is going to be at 2 o'clock, just as a reminder. And now, if anyone has a question or two for Peter?
Yes, please. Could you shout it out?
I was just wondering if you thought the science magazine was put there for your benefit, whether or not it is allowed for you to visit it and be staged.
Was the science magazine put there for my benefit? There was a whole stack of science magazines put there, and they were well thumbed through. So they went to a lot of effort if it was the stage. But to have one subscription for Science Magazine for a country of 25 million with no free access to internet is very small. But I think it might have been symbolic. There is a common ground. And there are some other good journals as well. I mean, I like science myself. But, maybe. On the other hand, we can only follow opportunities that are made available. And I think this is one. Thank you for your question. Yes, sir.
How do you deal with sort of the moral issue of some technologies may not be beneficial to export around the world, such as biowarfare and the ability of synthetic DNA? Are there limits to what we should be doing in transferring?
Sure. So the question is, well, there's another corollary to that question. The first question is, the use of the technology need not always be innocent. And is it possible that germ warfare is being undertaken? And I would have to say I would bet that there is some. So we were not there to provide the latest breakthroughs in molecular biology, but to represent American science as scientists. And I think the projects that have been identified, and of course no capital has been made available for collaborations with North Korea, are basically things related to ecology, agricultural sciences, and are not directly, I think, going to be sidetracked to nefarious purposes, but there always is a concern. And certainly we're not there to help the North Koreans engineer more potent military armaments, which both in traditional arms and nuclear arms are not making the world a safer place. I think the contacts come with a risk. The other risk is, of course, are we validating something which none of us should approve of? And I didn't go into it, but there are times where you're forced into situations where you know this could be manipulated. How can you maintain the fairness? We're there to reach out as scientists, to make contacts with their scientists, to achieve friendships, and not validate a regime which is cruel and is going to be limited. And the answer is not easy. I was this is December of 2011. No, it was October of 2011, invited for a science symposium at Pyongyang University of Science and Technology. And I was asked to say, in addition to my scientific lecture, at the end of the conference to read the farewell letter. And the farewell letter was unbelievable. I was to thank Kim Jong-il, he died actually a month later, for personally designing the conference and all the great things in our lives. And I thought, you know, what was it Oscar Wilde said about it is impossible to read The Death of Little Nell and not burst out laughing? I mean, this letter was so over the top. And I turned to the leaders, the non-North Korean leaders of this university, and they said, please, you must read this or edit it, but we must give credit or they'll close us down. So we edited out some of the more flamboyant thank yous and statements of grandeur to the regime and basically welcomed the young Korean students at Pyongyang University of Science and Technology into the global community of science. Well, they approved of my edits, and this was then translated through a translator, unlike the other lectures I gave there, because the members of the state Politburo were in attendance, and they don't speak English. A translator stood by my side, and I read the letter. At the last part of the text in the letter, students and faculty immediately burst into spontaneous standing ovation. And this was, of course, orchestrated, and I stayed at the podium. Now the translator is looking very nervous. I was going to say something off script. It's like, be careful. And I basically thanked them for being present and, as I said, welcomed them into the world community of science. At which point all the international visitors stood up and gave me a standing applause, and the Koreans all looked at each other in amazement. So you're given limited value here. But I think some positive contact, even though it carries a small risk, although I got to tell you, the amount of molecular biology I know is so negligible and outdated value that it couldn't increase their germ warfare. But I think it is a trade-off. Long answer to a short question.
Thank Peter again.